Hello, Year 9. So what we're going to do today is we're going to be having a look at why Britain followed a policy of appeasement. I will make it clear what appeasement is in just 2 minutes. So could you pop down the title of today's lesson, which is the question at the top of the screen now, as I just talk you through the outcomes. So by the end of today's lesson, we're going to have a look at whether or not this policy of appeasement was a reasonable policy and the right policy for Britain to follow. We're going to be looking at the reasons in the first part of the lesson of why they did, and then we're going to be having the rights and wrongs of that. Was this a good thing? Why wasn't it a good thing? And then we'll be able to draw our own conclusions. So just pause this and make sure you've got the title down, please. So what was appeasement then? This is our key term for today's lesson. So it's where you give your enemy, or someone you're in conflict with in some way, something they want in order to avoid conflict. So you, as children, have been appeased with lots of things all your life. You're in a shop, you're crying, your mum gives you a lollipop to appease you. Well, this is the policy that Britain followed with Germany just leading up to the Second World War. Essentially, it was where Britain decided not to stand up to Hitler and not to oppose or go against his aggression. We've already seen lots of things that he's done, and Britain chose not to act. Instead, they backed down. They gave in to Hitler's demands. This is what was called the policy of appeasement. We're going to be looking today at why they did this. All I want you to do from this slide, please, Year 9, is write down the definition of appeasement that's in bold at the top of the screen now. Pause the slide and have a go at that now, please. We're going to watch a couple of video clips now. Now, what we're going to do as we're watching is all I want you to do is I want you to write down in bullet points in your book any reasons for appeasement. Because what this video shows is why Britain followed this policy. We know that Britain gave in to Germany. So as we're watching this video, we're going to put down as many reasons as we can think of. So sit and watch and make those bullet points. The first section lasts just over 3 minutes.
In these 2 short minutes of silence, the peoples of the Empire remember. We pray that our statesmen may continue their work of ensuring that the terrible mistake of the years 1914 to 1918 may never be repeated.
1 year later, when this man, Neville Chamberlain, became Prime Minister, the peace seemed already to be slipping away. His chief task would be to try and avert war. His policy was summed up in one word: appeasement. Chamberlain had already seen one great war tear Europe apart. He believed another would destroy civilization. But Mussolini, dictator of Italy, was looking for military glory for himself and his country. The Russian dictator Stalin, mysterious and powerful, brooded over Eastern Europe. And Hitler, Führer of Germany, was planning to dominate Europe. Already in March 1936, Hitler, in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, had reoccupied the Rhineland. The British and French did nothing to stop him. Hitler hammered his triumph home to the Germans. His message was heard in Britain, especially by Chamberlain. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, Chamberlain did not object to rearming Britain, but he disliked having to do it by raising taxes and borrowing money.
In an arming world, we couldn't be the only great country disarmed. We simply had to build our defense forces again, and we had to pay for it.
By defence forces, Chamberlain was talking principally about the RAF and the Royal Navy. Navy's great task was to protect the British Empire, strewn around the globe from India and Africa and Canada through New Zealand and Australia to the East Indies. To protect the empire in the Far East, work had begun in 1921 on a great naval base at Singapore. On the surface, Britain looked confident and secure, in control of her empire.
So, from what we've looked at so far, the kind of things that you could have jotted down were that the new Prime Minister, Chamberlain, he believed that appeasement was needed because a new war would destroy civilization. It'd be so much worse than the last. Britain was also surrounded at this point by aggressive countries, so appeasement made sense in that way. It was also going to be very expensive to go to war, so actually what appeasement did was it gave a cheaper option rather than Britain having to constantly rearm. The other reason that it gives us there was it was about protecting the empire. That appeasement allowed us, rather than fighting in Europe, to have to support and uphold our empire that was spread out around the world. Make sure you've got some of those ideas jotted down. Let's have a look at our second section then. So in our second section, we're continuing to add to our bullet pointed list. So we already know that Britain are kind of worried about the destruction of civilization. They're worried about the aggressive countries they're surrounded by. It's going to be expensive to rearm and they want to protect their empire. Let's find out what else we discover.
On the surface, Britain looked confident and secure, in control of her empire. But the defense of that empire would pose insoluble problems. For one thing, we could not afford a war here in the East and at the same time fight the dictators in Europe. Many people believed the best way to avoid war was to support the League of Nations. On the surface, Britain looked confident and secure, in control of her empire. But the defense of that empire would pose insoluble problems. For one thing, we could not afford a war here in the East and at the same time fight the dictators in Europe. Many people believed the best way to avoid war was to support the League of Nations. It was a fine thing to believe.
There is, in our judgment, no disputes between nations that cannot be settled by peaceful means.
But the people of Abyssinia had found such talk empty and misleading when their land was invaded by Italian troops in 1935. Mussolini was doing his own empire building in East Africa, and the League did little to prevent him.
It was the most unbearable scene when the fallen emperor confronted the League of Nations. Italian journalists whistled their derision. Haile Selassie faced them with heartbreaking dignity.
Are the states present here today, asked Haile Selassie, going to set up a terrible precedent by bowing before force? What reply shall I take back to my people? The League made no reply. But in Britain, the desire for peace was so strong that many people continued to support the League, particularly the young. They sincerely believed that no one could really want war. A few Britons, like these ex-servicemen, went to Germany and were filmed chatting to Hitler about the 1914 war. They found him reasonable. Wasn't it reasonable to put German troops back into the Rhineland, which was, after all, German soil?
We British never felt anything but great respect for our German enemies in the war years across the other side of the trenches.
Whether Hitler was reasonable or not, back at home, the leader of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee, could think of many other reasons against rearming.
The government can find plenty of money for warships and airplanes. Why could they not find money to secure to everyone homes fit for living, clothing, food, and the means of a happy life.
Still, even the...
So we can see in this second clip a number of other reasons why Britain followed this policy of appeasement. They couldn't defend their empire and the country at the same time. Also, the League of Nations had failed, so Britain had to find a new policy to kind of support and defend themselves because they couldn't rely on the League of Nations anymore. Also, there was this massive anti-war movement back in Britain, particularly amongst the young. They didn't want to fight. They knew how bad that first war had been back in 1914 to 18, and they didn't want to face anything else like that ever again. Also, from what we saw in the video, some of Hitler's demands seemed reasonable. That was a good reason for appeasement. Why not give in to Hitler if what he was asking for was reasonable? Another reason was, we'd already mentioned about war being expensive, but this time that actually money should be spent on decent housing, decent food, decent lives for the ordinary people of Britain, rather than on weapons of war. And appeasement, if we were following a policy of peace, well, we could afford those things for the British people. And finally, from this section, was what happened in the Spanish Civil War. The fact that the British people had seen on the newsreels the horrors of what had happened in Spain, the pictures of the dead children, the bombing, the flattening of those cities such as Guernica. And therefore, they would prefer to give in to Hitler's reasonable demands and have peace. So our final section now, keep those bullet points going.
As Germany flaunted her military strength, the British people and their leaders could well imagine, could almost see the Luftwaffe over undefended British cities. Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister in May 1937. From the start, he took a strong personal interest in foreign affairs. In November, he sent Lord Halifax, soon to be his Foreign Secretary, to Berlin to find out what Hitler's claims in Europe really were. Hitler told Halifax nothing. As Germany flaunted her military strength, the British people and their leaders could well imagine, could almost see the Luftwaffe over undefended British cities. Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister in May 1937. From the start, he took a strong personal interest in foreign affairs. In November, he sent Lord Halifax, soon to be his Foreign Secretary, to Berlin to find out what Hitler's claims in Europe really were. Hitler told Halifax nothing. Instead, the visit turned into a polite social occasion. But 4 months later, on the 12th of March 1938, Hitler's troops marched unopposed into Austria. Any protests were drowned in a tide of wild enthusiasm. In open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler declared the Anschluss, or union, of Austria with Germany. He'd returned to the land of his birth as Führer of the Greater German Reich. But now Western Czechoslovakia was surrounded by the new Greater Germany. Here were the industrial powerhouses of the Czech state, the factories and the mines. Here too were fortifications vital for Czech defense. The Czechs had an efficient, well-equipped army, but against the enemy within, they had few defenses. 3 million Germans lived in Czechoslovakia, mostly in the frontier area called the Sudetenland. Propaganda from the new German Reich across the border was increasing the dislike and contempt they felt for their Czech rulers. In April 1938, Konrad Henlein, leader of the Nazi-backed German Sudeten Party, demanded self-government for the Sudetenland. It was a cruel demand. The Czechs stood to lose not just the Germans, but their industrial strength and their defenses as well. The Czech president, Beneš, seemed to have the choice of hanging on to the Sudetenland at the risk of war with Germany, or giving it up to live in peace. If he decided not to give it up, Beneš could count on the support of a Czech people angered by the Germans' demands. He could send out mobilization papers to his army and hope to call Henlein's and Hitler's bluff. Beneš could also appeal for help to France, Czechoslovakia's ally since 1924. But that was a prospect which alarmed the French government, led by Edward Daladier. In April, Daladier flew to London to sound out the British reaction. But he was to be told by Chamberlain to expect no help from Britain in a war over the Sudetenland. The Maginot Line was in fact where France's policies stopped. An immensely strong system of fortifications the French had built along the German border. This was France's answer to any future threats from Germany in the West.
Okay, so we've got our final reasons here. Now, I'm not going to take you up into this next story of what happens in Sudetenland particularly, because that's what we're going to be looking at in our next couple of lessons. So, final reasons then for why Britain followed the policy of appeasement. Well, it was the enthusiasm of the places that were taking over. We saw there the pictures of Austria. They seemed happy. Appeasement was the right policy if those countries wanted to be taken over, if they were happy to be part of Germany. It would seem wrong to go to war when countries were happy with what was happening. Another reason was that Britain really couldn't rely on France at this point. They only seemed bothered about their own borders. Talked about them only really wanting to defend that line of defence, the Maginot Line. And the final bit, which is really, really important, is that it all seemed a long way away. Britain didn't really want to fight about places like the Sudetenland. Most people have never heard of the Sudetenland, let alone Czechoslovakia. So we've now got a whole load of reasons for why. We're going to start to have a look now about the rights and wrongs of the policy. So was Britain right to follow this policy of appeasement? Was this the correct policy? We've got the list of reasons of why they did it. So some of that is covered here in this half of the table. So of course it was the right policy because people still had those vivid, those really, really strong memories of World War I. They remembered how awful it had been. They remembered how so many families up and down the countries had lost loved ones, or the loved ones that returned had come back entirely differently. They wanted to avoid that at all costs. And remember, as we saw there in the video, a lot of young people had pledged that they wouldn't fight and they didn't want that. They didn't want another war. Another reason why appeasement was the correct policy at this particular time was that Britain weren't ready. They hadn't been spending lots of money in the early 1930s rearming because they'd been going through the Depression and they needed time and space to rearm. What appeasement did was it gave them time to do that because they weren't yet ready. So appeasement was also about buying time in order to be able to get ready if war should happen in the future. Another reason that we haven't looked at yet was that in whatever happened next, America would be no good. They'd made it very clear from the end of the First World War that they didn't want to get involved in European affairs. They'd followed that isolationist foreign policy. They wanted to be alone. They wanted to concentrate on being rich, and they'd done that in the 1920s. Then the Depression had hit them very, very hard in the early 1930s, and they hadn't got back involved in European affairs. Britain and France didn't want to risk a war without America's troops and support. They'd been so vital in that last year of the First World War. They didn't want to risk going to war without them. One of the major reasons for why appeasement was the right policy is because by this point, people had kind of decided that the Treaty of Versailles was basically wrong. It had been unfair. It had gone too far on Germany. British people thought that actually, if Hitler took back some of the land that was taken by Versailles, that actually Germany would become peaceful. So this is all about what Germany wanted was reasonable. So remember on the video it talked about, wasn't it reasonable for Hitler to want troops back in the Rhineland? Wasn't it reasonable that the Germans within Austria wanted to be united with Germany? All of those things were good reasons for appeasement. And finally, Hitler was standing up to communism. That was something that Britain and many of its allies really, really disliked. They were worried about this new, scary system of government that had come up in Russia in 1917. It was totally alien and different, and the Russian leader, Stalin, seemed very aggressive. What many people in Britain thought was that Germany, being strong there in the centre of Europe, would stop communism ever reaching Britain. So why was it wrong then? We've got loads of good reasons for appeasement. Well, the first one's so obvious. It encouraged Hitler. It led him on. It made him think he could get away with anything. It led him to be more and more aggressive. He got away with each little step in the breaking of the Treaty of Versailles. And each time he broke a rule and nobody told him off, he broke more rules. He became more and more confident. He became bolder. Remember, he started rearming in secret. Once he unveiled it to the world and nobody did anything, he started rearming at a faster pace. Once he managed to remilitarize the Rhineland and got away with it, well, he decided, I'll try and take over Austria then. So each step made him bolder. So it encouraged him to do more and more. That links to the next one. It also allowed Hitler and Germany to grow stronger and stronger over time. What appeasement did, yeah, it bought Britain ready to prepare, but actually it allowed Germany to get stronger and stronger and stronger. Its army was becoming more powerful than Britain and France. In 1933 and 1935, it wasn't. They had a weak army. If they'd stopped Hitler growing stronger earlier, World War II may never have happened, or it may have been less devastating. It might not have lasted that 6 years. Another reason why many people have criticised appeasement is it put loads and loads of trust in Hitler's promises. He said, oh, this is all I want. All I'm doing is reuniting German people. All I'm doing is kind of building up my army so I've got the same level as everybody else. Essentially, what happened over time was Hitler became more aggressive and he broke promises. Appeasement was based on the fact that Hitler would stop when he got what he wanted and that he could be trusted. He was a man you could do deals with. Actually, you couldn't do deals with Hitler. Another reason why people might see that appeasement was a bad idea is it ended up humiliating Britain. Hitler was making a mockery of the sympathy of Britain and its people. It made us look back on it and feel really, really stupid. One of the major reasons is for why appeasement was so wrong is we're taking it as a good thing because it blocked communism. But what it actually did was it really scared Russia. Nobody wanted to make deals with Russia. And Russia was watching as Hitler took over more and more places, grabbing living spaces, expanding east. Well, Russia was in the east. Russia was waiting. When's it going to be our turn? When are they going to invade us? And they had no faith at all that Britain and France would stand in Hitler's way. Eventually, the policy of appeasement led to Stalin and Russia making a deal with Hitler. That was a real cause of World War II. Your main task today then, Year 9, I want you to answer the question, was Britain right to follow a policy of appeasement? And this is the task you're going to send to your teacher today. So using the information from the table, you can whiz back after I've finished speaking now, you're going to answer that question. It needs to have 3 clear paragraphs. So the first one, use all of them for the first column to explain why appeasement was a good thing, why it was the right idea, why Britain really had to follow that policy. In your second paragraph, sum up why appeasement was wrong. Why was it a bad idea? Try and sum up as many of those reasons as you can. And finally, produce a conclusion that explains your own view. There is no right answer to this. You're telling me what you think about the policy of appeasement based on everything we've looked at today. So you might decide that actually Britain had no choice. It was the only sensible policy at the time. Or you might decide that actually it led to so much bad, it allowed Hitler to get so strong. It doesn't matter what your judgment is as long as you explain it. So 3 clear paragraphs, and it should take you around 15 minutes. Pause this now, make sure you've got all of those ideas up in front of you and have a go at that question. 15 minutes, pause this and have a go at it. This is the point then where you're going to need to go back to your teacher and you're going to make a judgment. Do you think that the response of Britain was cowardly, pathetic, or do you think it was the only practical and pragmatic thing for them to do? You're going to have a little vote on Mentimeter and then you're going to give a reason for it. So obviously there's 2 things for you to do today. Number 1, you're going to make sure you send that 15-minute answer, that 3-paragraph answer to your teacher, and then you're going to go back now and you're going to vote on this. Thanks for listening and I'll see you soon.